In his conversation with Scott Pelley, Andrew McCabe explained why he felt it was necessary to launch obstruction of justice and counterintelligence investigations into the president after he fired James Comey. I spoke earlier to CBS News senior national security analyst Fran Townsend about whether the action was justified.
I have to say, so I was having been at the Justice Department and looked at these sorts of things. What I was listening for was he had to lay what's called a predicate. He actually used that word and then proceeded to lay out the facts that he was relying on for the predicate. And so he went about it exactly as a trained FBI agent would be expected. We can quibble whether or not it was quite enough. And clearly, Rosenstein had issues with it, and should he open it. But, I mean, he did what he was supposed to do. He opens up the counterintelligence and obstruction investigations. I don't have a problem with that.
Is there anything that you do have a problem with? Anything that he said that just didn't add up to you?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. One, here's this meticulous memo-taking, memo-writing FBI agent who's accused of lying 3 times to the Justice Department, and he claims he was confused. It doesn't make sense. Second, let's remember when he was first fired, CBS offered him the opportunity to come on air, and he didn't want to do it then. He's selling a book. And then the third thing I would say is this whole thing about the 25th Amendment. You know, he remembers the conversation. He tells Scott Pelley, I had nothing to add. I have no recollection of why or how it came up, which is bizarre because you've got to assume this is the only time in his career it's ever come up.
Right.
But he then selectively remembers that Rosenstein is counting votes in the cabinet. But when Scott asks him, well, who did he expect to vote what way? He doesn't remember that. And so there are pieces to this story that we ought to be skeptical about.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about, because as the Senate Judiciary Committee chairman, Lindsey Graham, was on Face the Nation, and he basically said, look, I want to subpoena McCain and Rosenstein. No, sorry, not McCain, sorry. McCabe and Rosenstein, specifically about this conversation about removing the president. What sort of questions would you have asked?
Well, you know, it's interesting because let's remember, neither of these people, McCabe or Rosenstein, was in any position to invoke the 25th Amendment, right? The 25th Amendment requires the vice president and a majority of the cabinet. And so that they had the conversation at all is a little odd to me. Now, as we were saying before we went on air, I mean, there's a lot of odd things going on in Washington, so nothing's out of the question.
Right.
But I do think, I understand Lindsey Graham's point. I don't know what we're going to gain from talking to 2 men, neither of whom had the ability to invoke the 25th Amendment, right?
And so I would say, you to remind everybody that Rod Rosenstein says, initially, when this came out in the media several months ago, he said, oh, I was joking. This was, you know, about wearing a wire. Right. Anyways, that it was just a joke. So has a completely different characterization than what McCabe has about this. But what would be the implications if, as you say, here are 2 men in positions where they're not actually in a position to invoke the 25th Amendment? Which would mean what? I mean...
Well, I mean, if Rosenstein or McCabe, as McCabe says, he had nothing to add to this conversation. So let's take McCabe out of it. He was never going to be involved in the invocation of the 25th Amendment. If Rosenstein had wanted to or thought it was appropriate, he would have had to have gone to a cabinet member who would have had to lead the charge, presumably Sessions or someone else. I just, the whole thing is so unlikely to me. It'll be interesting. The one thing we would get out of a Lindsey Graham hearing is you'd have Rosenstein under oath have to answer the questions about whether or not the allegations of McCabe are true.
Yes, and that would be very interesting, man. So Rod Rosenstein is on his way out.
Yes.
William Barr has been sworn in as the Attorney General, so he's going to be the one overseeing the Mueller investigation. Anything that you heard in the 60 Minutes interview that may have implications for the Mueller investigation?
I don't think so. Okay. Look, when I was in the Justice Department when Bill Barr was the Deputy Attorney General. He's kind of a lawyer's lawyer. He's a very respected, brilliant legal mind. And I have a lot of time for him. So I think we ought to look at Bill Barr as, while he's a fresh face, I expect will call balls and strikes as he sees them. I'm not worried about him sort of having an ideology or a particular outcome in mind.
Right. You know many of these characters. I just wondered, just as an aside, as you were watching the McCabe interview, Were you watching it as sort of gobsmacked as many of us were, or did you see something different?
No, I was. Look, I was, some of the more salacious allegations, as you can tell, I'm a little skeptical of.
Yeah.
But McCabe was, let's be honest, he was horribly treated. He was a career public servant. And I've got a lot of respect for the men and women of the FBI, including McCabe.
Some people say he had an axe to grind. He got fired 24 hours before his pension was going to kick in, and, accused of lying and leaking information. So maybe,
Yeah, that's right. And so I think we ought to be skeptical and wait to see what he's writing memos on some things, but not others. Those memos are in the hands of Robert Mueller, the special counsel, and will be part of that investigation. Yeah. And so the jury's still out for me on the McCabe interview and book until we have the stories of others who were involved.
All right. Fran, thank you so much.
Thanks.